Ooh, my goddamn garage, what you doing now, my goddamn garage? Where you going, babe, my goddamn garage? What you got now, my goddamn garage? We're talking Canada, my goddamn garage. It's where I live, babe, my goddamn garage. We'll grab a beer now, my damn garage. Have a seat, babe, my goddamn garage. Now, I've made this episode, I think this is the third time I've made it now. And every time I make it, I'm just not happy with it. And tomorrow is Canada Day, and I'm just going to put it out. To hell with it. But I'm going to add that caveat, though, that I'm not happy with this, and I wasn't happy with the other versions. And the story has stayed relatively the same because it's a story that's true, although I don't say what the conversation was. That's not for the public. But, however, my ruminations have changed a lot. And I've said all kinds of things. Plenty I'm not happy with. And some that I am happy with, but I don't want to share. And all sorts of things. Nonetheless, this is what I came up with. And this is what I'm going to put out. So, cheers. It was the morning after Canada Day 150. And there had been a number of protests about Canada Day from Indigenous groups and their allies leading up to the celebration. Decolonize 150 had become a slogan of sorts for various groups that didn't think Canada had anything to celebrate, since their belief was that Canada Day amounted to nothing more than a celebration of hundreds of years of oppression and cultural genocide of the native population. And they weren't exactly wrong. But it was far too reductive and simplistic a narrative, at least the way it was being presented in the various media that you would see it in. There was a more complex story to be told. It would take more time. But history does deserve nuance. There were still plenty of parties being planned for Canada Day all over the place, of course. And for some people, this drowned out the noise from the protesters. And the people celebrating would range from those who were entirely oblivious to the protests, all the way over to those who were hyper aware of them and had ready to go arguments that had been finely honed over many different internet comment sections. And I wasn't really involved in either movement, to be honest. Maybe I'm just too lazy, but both seemed too divisive and dramatic in their statements. Yeah, I simply couldn't see the pure evil that the decolonized 150 people saw. And I mean, maybe that's dramatic, but I wasn't on board with how far the people seem to be taking it a lot of the time. The history seemed more complex than the stories they were telling me. And I wasn't really anxious to go around making judgments on various people either, from today or from back then. But I also wasn't a fan of large crowds, nationalism in general. And because it seemed to be veering so close to jingoism all the time. And I didn't feel particularly proud of being Canadian, since I hadn't really done anything to earn it. Even if I had, its history was more complicated than something to be proud of. If I were to feel entirely a part of this chronology of people in this land, they would be more like a responsibility or something along those lines, I would imagine. But I did agree that history was written by the winners, and a lot of the history I was taught in school was incomplete. But later on, I went to university. I did a lot of studying on my own. I stayed somewhat current with the what they called post-colonial studies at the time, and now it would be called decolonial studies or something along those lines instead. So I was aware of arguments on both sides for quite some time, but I was aware more like in an intellectual curiosity kind of way, rather than somebody who was tied up in the arguments one way or another. It was more out of interest, But sure, history is written by the winners. But the older I got and the more I looked into it, it seemed like maybe history written by the losers was every bit as dishonest, just in a different way. But either way, I was still detached. I felt like an outsider. My family was an immigrant family, and we didn't really see Canada as home. Like, I could leave to another country and it wouldn't bother me that much. But I wouldn't call us particularly nationalistic. We weren't proud to be Canadian, but we weren't ashamed either. I remember my father warning about jingoism a lot when I was younger. He would point it out in American film. For us, nationalism was very low key, if at all. It was more a matter of some shared geography and culture, not much more. We'd cheer on the national hockey team, but without all the face paint. I don't know if I was our peripatetic background, both as a family and individuals, that is like robbed me for a love of the soil, or if I am just naturally inclined to shun groups, and as a result, I've over-realized some Western notion of the individual. But I really don't like groups, of any kind. They make me nervous and seem to reduce complex ideas into simplistic platitudes. The journey from the specific to the general sacrifices clarity for volume. But that aside, it was Canada Day 150. And these protests were on my mind, much like they are for everybody now, but in light of an entirely different conversation. I wrote this years ago, back when this happened originally, and a lot has happened since then. But I'm going to tell this story in light of how I wrote it then, and the fact it's being told now does change it. I recognize this. The day after Canada Day 150. So my son and I go off to the park so he could play and run around and do all the things kids need to do. I didn't want to go the day before because there was a Canada Day party there, and like I said, I don't like that kind of thing. So the park had been a meeting point for celebrations just the day before, and you could tell the second you got there too. The park itself looked like it was in the midst of a hangover. Bits of trash strewn about all over the ground, discarded maple leaf pins that said 150 on them. It was sad in a way. The park usually looked so clean. So we walked over to the swings, and my son started to show me how far he could jump from them. And while we sat there discussing imaginary worlds and mythical creatures, another father with child in tow showed up at the park. And it was just us, 2 fathers, 2 kids, no one else, which is unusual for this time in the morning on a nice day. I guess everybody was sleeping off the party the day before. His daughter wanted to swing too. So I got away and I stood over by the bench. The kids started swinging together, and the other father came over and sat down at the bench next to me. He immediately reached in his knapsack, opened up a beer, lit up a cigarette, and said, "You have a good Canada Day." And I answered honestly. I was like, I suppose. I said, I'm not very nationalistic. We didn't really celebrate it. And he looks at me and he says, "Fucking colonialism." He's native. He's got a strong accent. I've known lots of Indigenous people. I could tell. So anyways, I look at him. I say, "Yeah, sucks, man." And we understood each other. What much more is there to say? Sometimes a look says it all. And I don't know exactly what he was going through, but it's the day after the big celebrations. I knew about the protests, and he's in the park. He says fucking colonialism to me, and he's drinking beer right away. It doesn't take genius to figure something out about that, right? Anyways, I had hung out with people who were broken or hurt or something in some way like that many times, and drank in alleyways, by train tracks, in bush camps, too often myself. And I think I was more of a romantic. I wasn't really hurt in any ways. I just had this romantic notion about hitchhiking around and whatnot. And you meet a lot of characters these ways, right? So I didn't know him, obviously. That would be ridiculous of me to suggest. But something about who he seemed to be in this moment wasn't completely alien to me either. So in the past, though, I hadn't really heard fucking colonialism. What I had normally heard was fucking whitey. It didn't bother me. I never flinched. Maybe when I was younger. I don't know. It doesn't mean me. I know that. But this seemed new. The way he said it, and the fact he used the word colonialism instead, it seemed new. There was something different in the air. Something different about the way people were talking about this issue at this point. He was filled with resentment and anger and It was entirely understandable, even if through talking to him, it occasionally seemed like this was misdirected. But who am I to judge? You know, I just let him speak for the most part. You know, I wasn't really living the effects of what had happened the way that he was, obviously. So my perspective is going to be completely different than his is going to be. All I can do is just sit there, and there's not really much for me to say because he has an emotional attachment to things that I'm not going to understand. So, you know, we sat there and we chatted for maybe 45 minutes. It wasn't always on that topic. It jumped around all over the place. And during that time, he polished off 3 Colt 45s and smoked as many cigarettes. I recall thinking to myself, you know, is this man better or worse off due to colonialism? It seems like a ridiculous question, right? You say worse immediately. You know, the right-wingers that argue against this will say, oh, but he has electricity and heat and whatever. They brought out the Stone Age, all the arguments they're going to have. They're not ridiculous arguments. You know, there's a certain amount of luxury afforded in this society, and if you were to stand outside and choose where to live, or you may very well choose this kind of a world instead. But it doesn't, you know, nothing's going to make up for having your family torn apart. It doesn't matter, right? Better world or not, whether or not that's true, it has to happen. It has to happen a different way. We know that now. Now, when a civilization like ours makes contact with a tribe that has never had contact with industrialized society before, we avoid it. We put laws in place and don't go there. That doesn't always work out. I'm aware of that. But the intention is there now from the government perspective, at least. The responsible part of our culture seems to understand that it's best just left alone. We don't know how to do it. We don't know how to make that contact successful. So we don't do it at all. You know, the only way this could have been avoided is if the Europeans showed up and they were like, oh, someone here, better leave. But they didn't do that. Let's face it, people at that time of that type in that world, they're not going to sail across an ocean and then turn back around and give up. You know, they were ready for war if need be, or at least battle on a per ship basis, right? So I don't know what this is worth. What is a broken family structure worth? What trade-off are you going to make? There's nothing I can possibly say. Obviously, trying to revert to those pre-colonial times it's impossible. You can't put things back. You can't put the families back. You can't put the times back. We're all here now. We have to figure out some way to move forward. What is it we need to do to make that happen? And I don't, you know, I got ideas. But what am I going to do with them? I'm just some guy in his garage talking to a goddamn camera, right? There's nothing I can do with these ideas. If I ever were to be in a position where I could actually talk to someone important, we could sit down and have conversations. Maybe I could contribute. Who knows? It's not, everybody's got ideas, right? So it's hard to say exactly what it's going to take. But once the conversation was over, the guy looks over at his daughter and he says, let's go. We're leaving. She gets off the swing and she runs over to see him right away. He walks over to me. He gives me a big, huge hug. He says, thanks, man. And then he leaves. My son's still there on the swings. He waves bye to the daughter. Daughter waves bye to him. And the two of them walk away. And I'm left there thinking to myself, right? I had just been thinking about this goddamn issue on my way to the park the day before. And here I am now again, all these years later, thinking about it again. You know? And I didn't have any answers. I could look over at that bench and I could see those empty beers on the ground and the crushed out cigarettes. And the only thing I could really think to myself was, God damn, I could use a beer and a cigarette.
Bye.